endless searches across the desert, and a family trapped in a terrifying nightmare. But in just the last few hours, the landscape of the investigation has suddenly changed.
The message arrived on a Tuesday morning. It came not to law enforcement, not to the family. It arrived at the offices of TMZ, one of the most watched media outlets in the country, and what it contained would send shockwaves through an investigation that had already been grinding in silence for more than 2 months. Day 65. That was where the case stood when the ransom note surfaced again. The sender claimed to know where the body was, claimed to know where the person responsible was hiding. And for the price of half a Bitcoin, roughly $30,000, they were willing to share that information. The letter was not signed. It carried no verifiable identity. But the persistence behind it told its own story. This was not the first message. This was not a random tip from a passing stranger. This was part of a pattern, a campaign of contact, arriving in waves, each one more pointed than the last. And somewhere beneath the noise of all of it, one question refused to go away. Where was Nancy Guthrie? Hi viewers, before we go further, tell me something. Have you ever followed a missing persons case so closely that you felt personally invested in finding the answer? Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She lived alone in a quiet Arizona neighborhood, not far from the suburban outskirts of Cave Creek. A community where neighbors knew each other's routines, where the days moved at a measured pace, and where an elderly woman living independently seemed, by every outward measure, safe. She was not a recluse. She was not in poor health beyond what age carries. She was a woman with a daily structure, familiar surroundings, and a family that checked in on her. A heart monitor connected her to medical oversight.
They treated the scene like a search and rescue mission, a decision that Entin's reporting suggests may have been the investigation's first and most critical mistake.
Her daughter, Savannah Guthrie, one of the most recognized broadcast journalists in America, was never far from contact. That was the version of life Nancy Guthrie was living the last time anyone who loved her spoke with her normally. Then came a Sunday evening in February. Her phone was still inside the house. Her medications were on the counter. Her bag was where she always kept it. And her pajamas, the ones she changed into that evening, told investigators something that no forced entry, no overturned furniture, and no obvious struggle could tell them. She believed she was safe when she went to sleep. The back doors of the residence were found open. There were traces of blood near the entrance. And yet, for all the things that were wrong, the scene did not offer the clear, unambiguous story that investigators needed to move fast in the right direction. What it offered instead was a puzzle. One with missing pieces that would take weeks to even begin to find. 3 weeks before that night, on January 11th, surveillance footage later showed an unknown individual near the property. At the time, it appeared to be nothing, a person passing through, a shadow in an ordinary neighborhood. No alarm was raised. No report was made. But in the context of what happened weeks later, that footage took on a meaning no one was prepared for. Investigators came to believe it was reconnaissance. Someone had been watching, studying the patterns of a woman who lived by routine, learning when she was home, when she was alone, when the house was quiet. And 3 weeks after that first confirmed appearance, the same area became a crime scene. The leading theory, supported by physical evidence including camera footage, pointed not to a sophisticated operation, but to something more desperate and chaotic. A person who appeared to be physically unsteady, possibly under the influence of a substance, was seen carrying a heavy bag in footage connected to the area around the time of the disappearance. The working hypothesis among investigators, this began as a burglary targeting an elderly woman perceived to be an easy target, and something went wrong in a way that changed the nature of the crime entirely. But theories are not answers.
TMZ has just reported that they have received another ransom letter.
And by day 65, the investigation had stalled in ways that would later draw serious criticism. The critical first 48 hours, the window in which most cases are either solved or permanently complicated, were, according to insiders familiar with the case, mishandled. Evidence control was inconsistent. Federal coordination came later than it should have. And the early moments, when every minute still carried the weight of possibility, were not used the way they needed to be. A reward exceeding $1 million had been offered. The public had been watching. Tips had come in. And still, nothing had broken the case open. Then the ransom note arrived at TMZ on day 65. And on that exact same morning, Savannah Guthrie returned to national television for the first time since her mother's disappearance. She wore yellow, a color associated with hope and presence. She smiled. She held herself together in the way that only someone carrying an enormous private weight has to learn to do in public. She did not mention her mother. That silence was not missed by the people watching. Veteran investigator and former NYPD detective Joseph Giacalone publicly weighed in on the ransom correspondence. His read was pointed. The letters, he said, bore the profile of an opportunist. Someone consuming the media coverage and inserting themselves into the story, not a principal actor with actual knowledge. But there was one detail in the latest message that was harder to set aside. In earlier communications, the sender had written that time was important. That urgency mattered. This time, the message carried a different phrase entirely. Time, the sender wrote, was no longer important. That shift in language meant something to the people analyzing it. In missing persons investigations, change in tone around time, from urgency to indifference, often carries a specific and devastating implication. It suggested that whatever window had once existed may have already closed. The investigation was still open. The family was still holding on. And somewhere between the ransom letters, the media attention, the failed early response, and 65 days of silence, the truth was still out there, waiting to be found. But cases like this do not wait indefinitely. They grow cold. And this one was already beginning to.
This morning, Savannah Guthrie returned to the Today Show after a long absence. This was her first time in the spotlight since her mother, Nancy, went missing. Her return was incredibly striking. She chose to wear a bright, vibrant yellow shirt.
The night Nancy Guthrie disappeared did not announce itself. There was no raised alarm from a neighbor. No call to emergency services in the immediate hours after. No sound that cut through the quiet of a suburban Arizona evening and told the world that something had gone terribly wrong inside that house. What there was, instead, was a routine that simply stopped. Nancy had a pattern, the kind built over decades of living alone with intention. She rose at predictable hours. She took her medications at set times. She kept her phone close. She wore her heart monitor. She was, by every account from people who knew her well, a woman who understood her own schedule and kept to it with the discipline of someone who valued her independence and worked to protect it. On the evening in question, she had already changed into her pajamas. That single detail, the pajamas, became one of the first things investigators focused on when they began piecing together the timeline. Because it told them something no physical evidence at the door or in the yard could tell them alone. She was settled in for the night. She was comfortable. She was not expecting anything unusual. Whatever happened, it came to her. The back doors of the home were found open when the alarm was eventually raised. There were traces consistent with a struggle near the entrance, not the kind of scene that screams chaos to the eye, but the kind that trained investigators recognize as significant. Her personal belongings were inside. Her phone. Her bag. The medication she relied on daily. Nothing was missing in the way you would expect if someone had packed and left voluntarily. Nancy Guthrie did not walk out of that house on her own terms. The early hours of the investigation should have been a window that law enforcement used aggressively. In cases involving a missing elderly person, particularly one with medical needs, time from the first moment is not a resource. It is the resource. Every hour that passes without a fixed perimeter, a secured scene, and a coordinated response narrows the possibility of recovery. Those early hours were not used the way they should have been. Sources familiar with the investigation's internal handling later described the first 48 hours as disorganized. The crime scene was not controlled tightly enough in the beginning, which meant that the integrity of physical evidence was compromised before it could be fully catalogued. Searchers and civilians moved through areas before investigators had completed their work. The chain of custody for certain pieces of evidence became muddied. And federal coordination, the kind that brings in resources beyond what a local department can deploy, came later than the situation called for. By the time the investigation was operating at full capacity, the window that cannot be reopened had already closed. The surveillance footage that existed from the neighborhood and surrounding area became one of the investigation's primary anchors. Analysts reviewed hours of recordings looking for anything that could place an unknown person in the vicinity around the time of the disappearance. What they found was a figure, someone caught on camera near the area who matched no one who belonged there. The figure appeared to be moving with some difficulty. A physical irregularity in the gait, a limp or an uneven stride, was noted by investigators reviewing the footage. The person was carrying a large bag. The weight of it appeared significant. This was not the posture of someone passing through casually. Combined with the January 11th footage, captured 3 weeks before the disappearance, showing an unknown presence near the property, investigators began to shape a theory around what kind of crime this had actually been. The early public assumption was kidnapping. The word itself was loaded, and in the absence of confirmed information, it filled the space where facts should have been. But as the physical evidence was processed and the footage was analyzed more carefully, the working theory among investigators shifted. This appeared to have begun as a burglary. Not a planned abduction. Not a targeted operation designed to hold someone for ransom. A property crime. The kind carried out by someone who had studied the location, identified a vulnerable resident, and believed the risk was low. What changed the nature of the crime, what turned it into a disappearance rather than a theft, was something that went wrong during the course of that encounter. Exactly what happened inside that home, or immediately outside it, in those critical minutes remained unknown. But the evidence suggested an escalation that was not part of any original plan. That distinction mattered enormously, because it changed the profile of who investigators were looking for. Not a sophisticated criminal with resources and an escape strategy mapped out in advance. Someone reactive. Someone who made decisions under pressure that they had not prepared for. Someone who may have been physically compromised. The footage suggested a person not operating at full capacity, and who was now managing the consequences of a situation that had grown beyond anything they intended. The proximity of the property to the U.S. Mexico border added a layer that some investigators took seriously and others were slower to prioritize. The border was approximately 90 minutes away by car. That distance, to experienced law enforcement, was not reassuring. It represented a variable that could remove a person from the reach of American jurisdiction in the span of a single night. Some felt that possibility was not treated with enough urgency in the early stages. The reward money climbed. It passed $1 million, a number large enough, in theory, to motivate even reluctant informants to come forward. In cases of this profile, a reward of that size tends to generate a flood of tips. Some credible, many not, but enough volume that investigators can usually extract something actionable. The tips came in, but nothing that came in broke the case open. That silence, in its own way, spoke. It suggested that the person or persons with actual knowledge of what happened to Nancy Guthrie were either too afraid to talk, too far out of reach, or operating in a network where cooperation with law enforcement carried consequences that no reward could offset. 65 days in, the investigation was still standing at the same fundamental wall it had hit weeks earlier. No confirmed suspect. No arrest. No verified account of what happened after that back door was found open. Just a case that kept generating questions it could not answer. And the letters to TMZ that kept arriving, each one claiming to hold the answer, for a price. The next development in this case would test everything investigators thought they understood about the people sending those messages. And it would arrive in a way no one was prepared for. This is the kind of story that reminds us how fragile the line between an ordinary evening and the unknown can be. If this documentary moved you, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. We cover real cases, real lives, and the questions that demand real answers. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective matters, and someone watching alongside you needs to hear it. The ransom letters did not begin on day 65. That is what made the timing so difficult to read, and why investigators were slow to reach a clear conclusion about whether the person writing them had any actual connection to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, or whether they were something else entirely. The first wave of contact came earlier in the investigation, when the case had already drawn national media attention but had not yet reached the level of saturation that would follow. The initial messages carried a tone of urgency. Time, the sender wrote, was important. They presented themselves as someone with access to information that law enforcement did not have, a go-between of sorts, someone positioned between the truth and the people searching for it. Law enforcement and media analysts treated those early messages with skepticism. The details they contained were not specific enough to verify. The demands were structured in a way that did not fit the pattern of a legitimate ransom situation. And the sender's unwillingness to provide any proof of knowledge beyond vague claims made it difficult to treat the correspondence as credible. But the messages kept coming. And that persistence was its own data point. Investigators who have worked kidnapping cases, both at the federal and local level, note that genuine ransom situations tend to follow a different rhythm than opportunistic contact. A real actor with something to offer tends to make contact once, establish credibility early, and move quickly toward a transaction. What the TMZ correspondence looked like, to multiple experienced investigators who reviewed it, was something more calculated around public attention than around any actual exchange of information. Former NYPD Detective Joseph Giacalone, speaking publicly about the case, framed it plainly. The profile of the letter writer, he said, fit that of an opportunist. Someone consuming the media coverage in real time and using it as a platform. Someone watching the story grow and inserting themselves into it, not because they had knowledge, but because the story offered an audience. The coverage was enormous. Brian Entin of NewsNation had become one of the most consistent voices reporting on the case, broadcasting updates that were followed closely by a national audience. Nancy Guthrie's disappearance had moved beyond local news. It was a story that millions of people were tracking, and it was the kind of story that attracts exactly the type of contact the TMZ letters appeared to represent. Then came day 65. The message that arrived that morning contained several claims that stood apart from the earlier correspondence. The sender stated they knew where the body was. They stated they knew the location of the person responsible. They denied being the perpetrator themselves and claimed to be contacting from overseas. The price for the information was half a Bitcoin. What stopped investigators and analysts from dismissing the letter outright? The way they might have dismissed a clearly fictional account was one specific element. The tone had changed. Where earlier messages had emphasized urgency, this one said something different. Time, the sender now wrote, was no longer important. That phrase landed differently than everything else in the letter. In the context of a missing persons investigation, the way someone talks about time carries weight. Urgency around time suggests a belief that the person is still alive. That a window exists that can be acted upon. When that urgency disappears, when the language shifts to a position of indifference about how quickly things are resolved, the implication is that the outcome has already been determined. Harvey Levin of TMZ noted the shift publicly. The change in language, he said, was one of the most troubling elements of the new communication. The same morning the letter arrived at TMZ, Savannah Guthrie returned to her position on the Today Show. It was her first public appearance since her mother's disappearance more than 2 months earlier. She wore yellow. She conducted herself with the composure of someone who had made a choice, to be present, to function, to hold herself together in front of millions of people even while carrying something that no public appearance could fully contain. She did not address her mother's case on air. She did not need to. The audience already knew. And her presence on screen that morning, steady, controlled, professional, was watched through an entirely different lens than it would have been on any ordinary day. The timing was not lost on analysts. A new ransom letter arrives at TMZ. On the same morning, the victim's daughter, one of the most visible television personalities in the country, makes her first public return. Whether those two events were connected by the letter writer, or whether the timing was coincidence, could not be confirmed. But it raised a question that would not go away. Was the sender reacting to the public moment? Had they been watching, waiting for an event significant enough to draw maximum attention, and chosen that morning deliberately? Or was this simply the behavior of someone who had been watching the story for months and moved on instinct? The FBI had become involved in the investigation, bringing with it the capacity to trace digital evidence, including cryptocurrency transactions, which became relevant given that the ransom demand was specified in Bitcoin. Analyzing a Bitcoin transaction requires access to blockchain records and, in many cases, cooperation with exchanges that may or may not be based in jurisdictions willing to assist. Whether the FBI's analysis of the Bitcoin demand produced actionable results was not disclosed publicly. What was disclosed was that no arrest had been made. No suspect had been named. And the investigation, now past the 2-month mark, was facing the kind of public scrutiny that comes when a case of this visibility produces no resolution. Law enforcement had faced questions about the handling of the case from the beginning. The early scene management issues, the delayed federal involvement, the gap between the scale of the reward and the absence of any breakthrough despite it. These were the kinds of failures that, in a case covered this extensively, difficult to explain away. By day 65, the family was still waiting. The public was still watching. And the ransom letters, whether fraudulent or something more, had introduced a new element of uncertainty into a case that was already running out of road. The question that had sat at the center of the investigation from the first morning was still unanswered. What actually happened inside that house? And the answer to that question, if it existed anywhere, had not yet found its way to the surface. Everything that had been gathered, analyzed, and argued over in the 65 days since Nancy Guthrie vanished pointed toward the same conclusion: the truth was still out there. And the people closest to finding it were not sure they were getting any closer. What came next would not bring resolution, but it would expose just how far the gaps in this investigation actually ran. The stories that matter most are the ones that refuse to be forgotten. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you are here for every one of them. Drop your thoughts in the comments. This community is built on real conversation, and your voice is part of why these stories reach the people who need to hear them. There is a moment in every investigation that stalls when the people running it have to confront an uncomfortable truth. The evidence they have is not enough. The leads they have pursued have not opened into new territory. The witnesses they hoped would come forward have not. The tips that arrived in volume during the early weeks of public attention have been processed, and what remains after filtering is thin. The case is still open, technically, but the momentum that drives investigations toward resolution has slowed to something that barely registers. By day 65, the investigation into Nancy Guthrie's disappearance had reached that moment. The reward was still posted. The FBI was still involved. The family had not stopped. But the case had entered a phase that investigators who work missing persons cases recognize well, the phase where the errors of the early days begin to compound, and where the distance between what is known and what needs to be known feels greater than it did in week 1. The criticism of the investigation's early handling had become harder to deflect as weeks stretched into months. The issues identified by sources familiar with the case were not minor procedural oversights. They were the kinds of failures that directly affect the evidentiary foundation of a prosecution, assuming a prosecution ever became possible. The crime scene had been compromised in those first critical hours. Individuals who were not authorized to be in sensitive areas had moved through them before the scene was fully documented and secured. Once that happens, the legal admissibility of certain physical findings becomes a question. Defense attorneys, if a case ever goes to trial, look for exactly these kinds of procedural gaps. They do not need to prove innocence. They need to introduce doubt. And a compromised scene gives them material to work with. The investigators assigned to the case in the earliest hours had been, by multiple accounts, not equipped for an investigation of this complexity. That is not an indictment of individual officers, it is a structural observation about what jurisdictions with limited experience in major missing persons cases sometimes face when those cases arrive without warning. The systems that should have escalated the federal response earlier did not move with the speed the situation required. Those gaps had consequences. Digital evidence presented its own challenges. The theory around router and Wi-Fi tracking. The idea that the movements of devices in and around the property could be reconstructed to establish a more precise timeline was raised early but pursued slowly. By the time the relevant data was being requested and analyzed, the window for accessing certain logs had narrowed. Digital records are not permanent. Providers retain data for set periods. Delays in requesting the data can mean the data is gone before investigators get to it. That possibility, that critical digital evidence may have aged out before it was collected, was something sources close to the case spoke about carefully. But they spoke about it. The border proximity remained a factor that no part of the investigation had been able to definitively account for. At 90 minutes from the U.S. Mexico border, Cave Creek sat inside a geography that had, in other cases, made the difference between an arrest and a permanent disappearance. Crossing that border does not require documentation or a formal process for someone who knows the terrain. And for someone attempting to avoid accountability, the other side of that border represented a threshold that American law enforcement cannot cross unilaterally. Investigators had not confirmed that anyone connected to the case had crossed the border. But they had not been able to rule it out, either. The $1 million reward? A figure that, in most circumstances, is large enough to break the silence of almost anyone on the periphery of a crime, had not produced the breakthrough the family and investigators had hoped for. The absence of that breakthrough told its own story. It suggested that the people who knew something were not in a position where a financial incentive was the deciding factor. Either they were unreachable, or the consequences they feared for speaking were greater than the reward being offered. In investigative terms, that points toward one of two possibilities. Either the answer to what happened to Nancy Guthrie was buried inside a network, criminal or otherwise, where loyalty, fear, or geography made communication with law enforcement effectively impossible. Or the person responsible had managed to put enough distance between themselves and the case that no one in the informant community had anything concrete to offer. Neither possibility was a comfortable one. The FBI's cryptocurrency team had been working through the Bitcoin demand from the TMZ letters. Blockchain analysis, the process of tracing the movement of digital currency across a public ledger, is a technical discipline that has produced results in other high-profile cases. But it requires cooperation from exchanges, it requires jurisdictional access that is not always available, and it requires that the person at the other end of the transaction made identifiable errors in how they handled the currency. Whether the sender of the TMZ letters made those errors was not publicly confirmed. What was publicly confirmed, or more precisely, publicly apparent, was that by day 65, there was no named suspect. There was no confirmed arrest. There was no verified account of what happened to Nancy Guthrie after that February evening. There was a family in a position that no family should have to hold for this long. There was a legal team involved. There were advocates who had been working the public-facing dimensions of the case. And there was Savannah Guthrie, who had returned to the screen that morning in yellow, in composure, in silence about the one thing she could not stop thinking about. The investigation was at a crossroads that it had not been able to navigate. The leads it had were not producing. The evidence it had gathered was complicated by early errors. The communications it was receiving through media outlets were unverified. And the geography of the case offered a variable, the border, the networks potentially operating across it, that no reward and no press conference could address on its own. What the investigation needed was something that had not appeared yet. A piece of information specific enough to move past the wall it had hit. A witness willing to step forward. A transaction that could be traced. A communication that contained something verifiable. That piece had not arrived. And in cases like this, cases that go past the 60-day mark without a named suspect, the probability of resolution does not increase with time. It decreases. The case was still open. The family was still fighting. but the ground beneath this investigation was less solid than it had been at the start. And somewhere in the space between what was known and what was not, between the ransom letters and the surveillance footage and the stalled leads and the border 90 minutes away, Nancy Guthrie was still waiting to be found. The most important stories are the ones we refuse to let go quiet. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you are always here when the next one comes. These are real people, real families, and real questions that deserve answers. Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice keeps these conversations alive. There are cases that resolve. There are cases that close without answers. And then there are cases that stay open, technically active, publicly watched, humanly urgent, while the weeks and months pile up around them and the answers remain locked somewhere out of reach. The disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, as of day 65, belonged to that last category. The investigation was not closed. No one had declared it cold. But the markers that signal a case moving toward resolution, a named person of interest, a warrant served, an arrest, a recovery, were all absent. What the case had instead was a file that kept growing without the piece that makes all the other pieces make sense. And behind that file was a family. It is easy, in a case that generates this level of media attention, for the human reality at its center to become abstract. The numbers, reward amounts, days elapsed, Bitcoin values, surveillance timestamps, can accumulate until the case feels more like a puzzle than a life. Until the name Nancy Guthrie starts to sound like the title of a story rather than a person. She was 84 years old. She had lived a full life, independently, on her own terms, in a home she knew. She had a daughter who was on national television every morning, and who now carried the weight of not knowing her mother's whereabouts through every public moment she navigated. She had a family that had not stopped searching, not stopped speaking, not stopped holding out for the answer that had not yet arrived. That is the reality at the center of everything else. The ransom letters, whether they were sent by someone with genuine knowledge or by someone exploiting the story for attention, had introduced a new dimension of uncertainty into the 65th day of this investigation. The tone shift in the latest communication, from urgency to indifference about time, had done something specific to the atmosphere around the case. It had moved the public conversation from a question of where Nancy Guthrie was to a darker and more unspoken question about what the answer to that might look like when it finally came. Investigators were still working. The FBI's involvement meant that resources were still being applied. Cryptocurrency analysts were still tracing what could be traced. Surveillance footage was still being reviewed. Tips were still being logged. But the investigation was operating inside a set of constraints that had been built, in part, by the errors of its earliest days. The scene that should have been secured wasn't fully secured. The evidence that should have been collected immediately wasn't all collected in time. The federal coordination that should have arrived faster arrived late. Each of those failures was a door that closed a little earlier than it should have, and what was on the other side of those doors would never be fully known. Joseph Giacalone had spoken about the opportunist profile of the letter sender, and that assessment carried weight among people who had studied the correspondence carefully. But even if the letters were entirely fraudulent, even if the sender had no connection to the case whatsoever, the fact that they were arriving at all reflected something real about this case. It reflected the vacuum that had formed where answers should have been. When an investigation stalls publicly, it creates space. And the kind of people who fill that space, who insert themselves into a story they have no standing in, are drawn to it precisely because no one has definitively closed it. The absence of resolution is its own invitation. Every day the case remained open without a breakthrough was another day that invitation stood. The border theory. The burglary gone wrong theory. The idea that someone who appeared physically unsteady on camera, carrying a heavy bag, had made decisions in the space of a few minutes that changed the outcome of an elderly woman's life. These were not confirmed facts. They were the working hypotheses of investigators who had 65 days of evidence and still could not name a suspect. And yet, even in the absence of a named suspect, even with the investigation at a wall, the case was not without direction. The footage existed. The January 11th sighting existed. The physical evidence at the scene, compromised though parts of it were, still offered information. The digital records that had been obtained were still being processed. The cryptocurrency trail, however faint, was still being followed. Investigations that appear to stall sometimes break open in a single moment. A tip that comes in on day 80 that no one expected. A transaction that gets traced to an account. A person who was on the periphery of the story and said nothing for months who suddenly, for reasons of their own, decides to speak. That moment had not arrived for Nancy Guthrie's family. But the people working this case, and the family behind it, had not stopped believing it could. What this case had exposed, beyond the specific circumstances of one woman's disappearance, was a set of vulnerabilities that extend far beyond any single investigation. The speed of federal response in cases that cross jurisdictional lines. The protocols for scene management in the first hours of a missing persons case. The infrastructure for digital evidence collection in a landscape where critical records are only available for limited windows of time. The question of what a community 90 minutes from an international border means for accountability in cases that may cross it. These are not abstract policy questions. They are the conditions that determined what investigators had to work with on day 65, and what they didn't. Nancy Guthrie was more than the case that bore her name. She was a woman who had lived 84 years and deserved to be found. Her family deserved answers. The people who watched this story from across the country, who followed the updates and shared the reward information and hoped for a breakthrough, deserved to know what happened. As of this account, those answers had not arrived. The case remained open. The reward remained posted. The family remained in the painful space that families in this situation occupy, holding hope and grief in the same hands, waiting for the day when someone, somewhere, decides that what they know is worth telling. Somewhere between the silence and the unanswered questions, the truth about what happened to Nancy Guthrie was still out there. And it had not finished waiting to be found. If this documentary stayed with you, if this story reminded you why these cases matter, please subscribe to this channel and turn on your notifications. There are more stories coming. Stories about real people, real investigations, and the questions that refuse to be left behind. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Leave your thoughts in the comments. The conversation around cases like this is part of how they stay alive.